Hi everyone, this is Srinivas, Product Manager ITAM. We're very excited to bring this new feature on Microsoft SQL Server, which is called as Microsoft SQL Server Advanced Cost Optimization. So let's move forward and understand what this feature is about. So we know that SQL Server is used by organizations worldwide. In fact, it is one of the most costliest software from Microsoft, but organizations are using it. And we also understand that SQL Server enterprise licenses are approximately 4 times costlier than SQL Server standard licenses. And large organizations have a mix of both SQL Server enterprise and standard licenses, and they're looking for mechanisms to optimally assign these licenses so as to achieve compliance with cost savings. Additionally, organizations use software assurance a lot, which is a Microsoft benefit, which allows for many important benefits such as unlimited virtualization, license mobility, new version rights, and so on. However, software assurance entitlements are about 25% costlier than non-software assurance entitlements. Again, large organizations have a mix of both Microsoft software assurance entitlements and non-software assurance entitlements. And they're looking for mechanisms to optimally assign these licenses, again, to achieve compliance with cost savings. And so what this feature does is it balances both these aspects. How can we be compliant while being cost effective? And this feature is about that. It is about making sure that organizations are compliant as per the licensing rules of Microsoft, but at the same time, be cost effective while assigning the licenses. So this feature is about license compliance with cost savings. And it's about balancing license compliance and cost effectiveness to maximize cost savings for an organization on their Microsoft SQL Server cluster deployments. And this is based on several factors. The factors include order of license consumption after scanning the entire infrastructure. What this means is that ServiceNow is going to scan your entire infrastructure and determine on which clusters or host should the most cost-effective license be applied. For example, if there is a highly virtualized cluster, it's more effective to use SQL Server Enterprise license on the host layer if you have got software assurance in place, because if you have got enterprise with SA and you use it on the host layer, you can run unlimited number of VMs on it. And that is more cost effective. However, if you have just got a standalone host, it's more cost effective to license it using a non-software assurance entitlement because you do not require the benefits like license mobility there. So what ServiceNow SAM is going to do is that it's going to scan your entire infrastructure, determine where it is more cost effective to apply which license, whether it has to use SQL Server Enterprise or SQL Server Standard, where it has to apply software assurance benefits, where it is more prudent to apply non-software assurance benefit. And then it would apply those licenses so that you are cost effective as well as license compliant as per the licensing rules of Microsoft. So this is the feature in a nutshell. In addition, we have added a SQL Server infrastructure report, which is a report that showcases all your Windows and SQL Server deployments across on-prem and cloud infrastructure. In addition to the information that you have got your SQL Server deployed on-prem or on the cloud, it would provide information on which cluster is that SQL Server deployed, what is the host processor count, what is the host core count, what is the virtualization technology being used, what is the VM core count, and so on and so forth. And in one view, SAM managers would be able to determine the details of their SQL Server deployment along with the attributes in one report, which is very helpful during an audit. So this is another very interesting feature that we have brought out for SQL Server licensing. Now, before we go into the feature details, let's spend some time to understand the licensing rules. Of course, we'll not go into details about the licensing rules, but it makes sense to just go over them in a brief view. So we know that there are two types of licensing models. One is the core-based licensing model, and the other one is the server-cal licensing model. In the core-based licensing model, we license cores on the physical or the virtual machine, whereas on the server-cal model, we license servers or virtual machines and client access licenses for each device or user accessing the SQL Server. And core-based is used when it's difficult to count the number of users or devices connecting to the database, and server-cal is used when it's easier to count the number of users or devices connecting to the database. Core-based is applicable for both SQL Server Standard and Enterprise, whereas server-cal is applicable only for SQL Server Standard. In terms of virtual machine licensing, you could license all the cores on the virtual machine. With SQL Server Enterprise Edition, you get the option to license either the virtual machine or physical server, whereas on Standard, you're only allowed to license the individual virtual machines. If you go into more details, such as software assurance, with software assurance, you get unlimited virtualization on SQL Server Enterprise, which allows for unlimited number of VMs to run if the host is completely licensed. You get license mobility across server farms, wherein the licenses can be assigned to the VM as often as needed as it moves across the clusters. And so on and so forth. There are licensing rules for cloud licensing and for non-production use as well. So this is a brief of the licensing rules of SQL Server. Now let's go to a use case of SQL Server license optimization on-prem. Let's first understand a conventional approach of licensing SQL Server clusters. Now we know that customers and organizations use SQL Server a lot. They deploy SQL Server Standard and Enterprise across the cluster. And they use SQL Server on standalone host as well. If you see, cluster A has got SQL Server Standard deployed on about 30 VMs, which are running at about 5 hosts. There are SQL Server Standard deployments on a standalone host as well. On cluster C, we have got SQL Server Enterprise running on about 80 VMs on 10 hosts. On cluster X, we have got mix of SQL Server Standard and Enterprise running on about 2 hosts. And on cluster Y, we have again Standard and Enterprise running on about 7 hosts. However, there is host affinity configured here. Now, in the conventional approach, you could have licensed the cluster A with SQL Server Enterprise with SA license. However, this is wasteful. You could have applied your standard with SA license here on the standalone host. On cluster C, you could have applied your enterprise without SA license. On cluster X, SQL Server Enterprise with SA license could have been applied. And on cluster Y, SQL Server Enterprise with SA license could again be applied. However, let's see if it is cost effective or not. Of course, in terms of licensing rules, you may be compliant, but you may not be cost effective because it's a wastage of rights. In cluster A, if you see, you have used your SQL Server Enterprise with SA license here. However, it makes more sense to use it in a more highly virtualized environment, maybe cluster C, which has got about 80 VMs, which has got a very high number of virtual machines running SQL Server on it. So you have kind of wasted your license. You used your SA license or software assurance license on a standalone host, which again is a very non-cost effective way to license a standalone host because you're not using the benefits of license mobility here. So it makes more sense to maybe use this license on a cluster where there are a number of VMs moving across, because then you could have used your license mobility benefits. Again, on cluster C, you have used your SQL Server Enterprise without SA license here, which is again a wastage of license, because if you license the host layer here, you get the rights to use 10 VMs, because if you license 10 hosts, you can run 10 VMs. And then you have to license again the 10 hosts to run an additional 10 VMs and so on. And you can see that you would have to require more number of licenses in this particular case. In cluster X, again, you are using your SQL Server Enterprise with SA license here, whereas you could have used a mix of your enterprise and standard license, which is probably more cost effective. And again, the same use case here where you are wasting your SQL Server Enterprise with SA licenses, because you could have used a mix of your standard and enterprise licenses. So in this particular use case, you can see that you've got a mix of enterprise and standard licenses, a mix of your software assurance and non-software assurance licenses. But because of the wastage of licenses, the total cost of SQL Server licenses is about $3 million, which is quite high. Now let's see the ServiceNow SAM approach of licensing. So ServiceNow SAM provides an optimized licensing approach in this particular use case. So you can see here that on the standard licenses with SA were applied here, because it's more cost effective to use your SA licenses here, because there are 30 VMs which are moving across, and maybe you get license mobility benefits here. And hence it's more cost effective to use your SQL Server Standard with SA licenses. SQL Server Standard without SA licenses or non-software assurance licenses can be used on a standalone host, because you really don't require license mobility here, and hence it's more cost effective. On SQL Server Enterprise licenses on cluster C, it's more cost effective to consume your SQL Server Enterprise with SA licenses here, because if you license the host layer completely, you get unlimited virtualization benefit, wherein you could run unlimited number of virtual machines on the same. On cluster X, which has got a mix of SQL Server Enterprise and Standard, it makes more sense to use a mix of SQL Server Enterprise and Standard layer licenses on the VM layer here, because it's more cost effective. On cluster Y, again, it's more cost effective to license the VM and host using a mix of SQL Server Enterprise and Standard layer. And hence you can see here that the total cost of SQL Server licenses is about $0.9 million, which is way less than the conventional approach. And hence, using the conventional approach, you would be compliant, but you could ultimately be not cost effective, because you're using $3 million. On ServiceNow SAM approach, you are just spending $0.9 million, which is about 70% more cost saving. So you can see that ServiceNow SAM makes the most cost-effective decision while being compliant as per the licensing rules of Microsoft. So let's see this in action through a demonstration. So I've logged into ServiceNow SAM workspace, and I'm on 2017 Enterprise. I can see that I've got 100 rights with software assurance. And now, as a SAM manager, I would want to know how the licenses got consumed. So I can go to the license metric results. I can see that I've got 100 rights owned on the license metric of per core, which is the licensing model of Microsoft. And about 64 licenses are required. That is, 64 licenses got consumed, and I'm compliant. But as a SAM manager, I would want to know how these licenses got consumed. So I can go to 64, I can drill down, and I can see that these are all the devices which are consuming the license. In our previous example, we saw that cluster C used enterprise with SA licenses on the host layer. So if I just want to uh, just filter out cluster C, I can just search for cluster C here. And I can see that is virtual is false. That means that the licenses were applied on the host layer. So if the host is completely licensed, you get unlimited number of VMs, uh, unlimited virtualization, which helps you to run unlimited number of virtual machines on that particular cluster. So ServiceNow SAM is able to figure out that in this particular cluster, it makes more sense to license using SQL Server Enterprise with software assurance. Now I can go into license required section. I can understand how the licenses got consumed. I can see and read about the per core licensing model. I can see that this license was consumed by this particular device, which has got one processor and two core, and hence the licensable cores are four, because the minimum cores per processor are four. I can go into software installs licensing details, and I can understand that about 80 virtual machines have got SQL Server Enterprise installed on them. And in this particular use case, it's more cost effective to license at the host layer, because if you license at the host layer, you can get unlimited virtualization, which means that you could run all these 80 virtual machines on the same. So we can see that ServiceNow SAM is able to apply the licenses in the most cost-effective manner in this particular use case. Now, if I move back to the use case, I can see that we covered cluster C. Now let's move to SQL Server Standard and understand how the licenses got applied there as well. So I can go to 2017 standard, and I can go to the entitlements here. I can see that I've got one entitlement with perpetual and software assurance, and the other entitlement with just perpetual. That means that it has no software assurance on it. I can go to license metric results, and I can see that the licenses got consumed. Now I can move to number 4 to understand how the licenses without SA got consumed. And I can see that these licenses were applied on the standalone host. So this is also very important, because on the standalone, you don't require license mobility benefits or software assurance benefit, and hence ServiceNow SAM is able to apply in a very cost-effective manner this license on a standalone host, which is more cost-effective in this particular use case. Now moving to the software assurance rights, I can again understand how the licenses got consumed. And in this particular use case, let's check for cluster A. And I can see that in this particular use case, the licenses got applied on the VM layer, because you can see that the is virtual is true. And you can see that about 30 VMs are there. So the licenses got applied on the VM layer for cluster A, because it's more cost effective, because it uses license mobility benefits. And in this particular use case, it's more cost effective to license SQL Server Standard with software assurance rights on the virtual layer. So the licenses got applied on the virtual layer. So you can see that ServiceNow SAM is able to figure out what is the most cost-effective mechanism to license a particular device based on whether SQL Server Standard or Enterprise is installed on them, or software assurance and non-software assurance entitlements are available for the same. So that is a brief demonstration about cost-effective license management by ServiceNow SAM. Now we talked about another report that we have introduced, so that you can find in the report section. And it's known as the Windows and SQL Server Infrastructure Details Report. I can click on the same, and it provides all the details about all your Windows and SQL Server deployments across your infrastructure, be it on-prem or the cloud. You can understand what is the cluster on which the SQL is deployed, what is the host, what is the host processor count, what is the virtualization technology, what is the virtual server, what is the VM processor count, VM core count, and so on and so forth. And this is really important details during an audit where SAM managers want to know through one view what is the infrastructure on which the SQL or Windows is deployed. So that completes our demonstration about SQL Server uh, improvements or enhancements in Tokyo. Thank you. Please let us know if there are any questions.